What is the saddest fact? You know that most people will not know. Story one: about a third of people with epilepsy don't respond to meds. There's this thing called SUDEP, too, which is sudden unexplained death in epilepsy, where a person goes to sleep and just dies. My dad suffered from this. He would take his meds, but sometimes it wouldn't work. Well, if he had lots of stress in his life, he would be on the floor having a seizure. He trained me on how to take out the keys in the car if he was driving and pulled over. One time he had one on our way to the highway. I was late for school. He had a seizure. I pulled over and he came back wanting to grab the keys from me. He didn't know he had a seizure. He passed away 6 years ago from a heart attack, but I suspect it was the stress on his body. I was not there when he passed. Horrible illness. Would not wish it on my worst enemy. Story two: there were over 55 million people worldwide living with dementia in 2020. This number will almost double every 20 years, reaching 78 million in 2030 and 139 million in 2050. Much of the increase will be in developing countries. Already 60% of people with dementia live in low and middle income countries, but by 2050, this will rise to 71%. And as someone who's worked memory cares, it's not looking pretty. We're always at max capacity. Long wait lists. It's so expensive. And even then, the conditions are just sad. Even with proper training of staff, they're so understaffed. People are falling and getting injured all the time, eating their own feces, getting violent. Families would be appalled if they spent a full day at one. It's terrible that the mind goes, but the body seems to trudge along for many years. Ours opened in 2017, and we still have an original member there. He's still kicking along, but cognitively worse and worse. It's almost impossible for families to care for them alone, unless you don't work and can provide 24/7 supervision. It's a sad reality. And at some point, I think society is just not going to care for these people, and the norm is going to let them die. Story 3: the disappearance of Geraldine Largay haunts me. She was hiking on the Appalachian Trail and became lost when she left the trail to relieve herself. While lost, she used her survival skills to survive for nearly a month, but eventually succumbed to starvation and exposure. When her body was found 2 years after her death, there was a note there reading, "When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Carrie. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me, no matter how many years from now." During the time she was lost, she tried multiple times to call for help, using her phone, but there was no signal. She saw multiple search planes and helicopters, but they could not see her through the thick trees. She tried to set fires to nearby trees to let them know she was there, but couldn't manage it. Towards the end of her life, she thought about trying to climb up onto a hill above the canopy, but by then she was just too weak from starvation to do so. She died in her sleeping bag after 26 days of holding on for as long as she could, hoping help would come, but it never did. We know all of this because she wrote it down in a journal she had with her. And before she died, she wrote a note to her husband saying, "George, please read XOXO on it." Perhaps the most gut-wrenching fact of all is that Geraldine was found only about 2 miles off the trail, heartbreakingly close to salvation the entire time. Story 4: ex-wedding photographer here. A lot of people are wildly disappointed with their wedding day, like so much so they lash out at wedding vendors. One of the main reasons people quit working in the wedding industry is due to ongoing abuse from their clients. You can do one tiny thing less than perfect, and they can turn on you. I've even seen two different photographers move cities entirely just to escape past clients. In the industry, we call it the wedding hangover, and it usually hits 2 weeks after. There's such a huge over expectation, in the US at least, for your wedding day to be this perfect, ideal day where it's normal to spend $100,000 so that everything is beautiful and perfect. Of course, it's never going to be perfect. Of course, everything isn't going to go right. It's absolutely inevitable that people will be disappointed. The wedding industry itself has partly created the problem. Story 5: as people age, they often experience loss of friends, family members, and social connections. In many cases, elderly individuals may find themselves living alone, with limited mobility, and facing health challenges that further isolate them from the outside world. Studies have shown that chronic loneliness among the elderly can have serious negative effects on physical and mental health, leading to depression, anxiety, and even increased mortality rates. Despite their wealth of life experience, wisdom, and often a desire for companionship, Many older adults struggle with profound feelings of loneliness, which can go unnoticed by society at large. This is why I took a job that allowed me to have breakfast with my grandfather before work. My dad said he turned into a different person on their daily phone calls after I started. We got into a good routine of me coming over, telling him to sit down while I cooked and cleaned up. Then we'd sit outside and smoke until it was time for me to go to work. Unfortunately, he found out he had cancer 2 days after his 85th birthday. He had been complaining of shoulder pain and waited until my day off to drive himself to the hospital. He died a month later in his home. We only had 3 months of breakfast together, but I'm so glad I did that. I gave him something to look forward to every day. Story 6. Very few people in your life would actually drop what they were doing to help you. Cherish the ones that would. This is something that sparked a huge fight with my ex. A buddy of mine called me after he had just finished his shift. This guy has been my best friend and more in my life than anyone in my family. He got stuck at work. His car was dead and it was snowing like Emma of Fear despite it being 1 a.m. and all the snow. I didn't think twice. She got on my case about it. Why risk it? It's not worth it, etc. And told her that this is the kind of friend that, if he needs something, I don't ask questions and make excuses. And proceed to tell me that saying crap like that is lip service to make people feel better. Story 7. If you watch footage of the 9/11 aftermath, you'll hear a ringing sound in the background. It's not actually ringing, it's a chirping device on first responders that were buried in the debris. Usually the device doesn't make a constant noise, but there were so many people buried that it created an unbroken wail coming from under the rubble. Also, in the weeks and months following 9/11, there were a lot of cars covered in dust on the streets surrounding what used to be the Twin Towers. These were victims of the attack who were never able to return. Story 8. It took my dog a couple years to realize he was here to stay. I was his seventh owner. I am his last. He was returned to the shelter multiple times for behavioral issues, and when he acted out, he would immediately get depressed, thinking he was going back. Very good dog. Very happy now, and has turned into quite an entitled princess. I had a dog from the shelter once that when I first got him, he seemed okay. But when I got him, he didn't leave my side. One time I stopped for gas, and he was looking at me out the window. I started walking into the gas station to pay and get a coffee, and he just started screeching in the car, like the most scared I ever saw a dog. I realized he had severe separation anxiety. I went back and picked him up and took him into the shop with me and held him the whole time. I think he realized then I was going to take care of him. I let him sleep on the bed with me at night and accommodate him as much as I could. Leaving him to go to work was rough, but eventually he got over it and then got over it entirely. Near the end of his life, I'd just be like, okay, time to go to work. And he'd go get in his crate and bury himself in a blanket and was fine with it. Story 9. Your loved one didn't say any last words. Also, a weird thing that happens sometimes is that 24H before death, they get a sudden spike of energy, which may look like they're getting better, so it confuses the family members sometimes. Also, 80% die alone. Working with old people broke me a little bit. My mom called and said my dad refused to eat, and she thought he was going to die soon. It was late at night, and there was no way for me to get down to them. They live 350 miles away. So I got the early train down the next day. Got there, and my dad was better than he had been in ages, wanted me to cook him pasta carbonara for dinner. So I went to the store and got the real good pork cheek and all the other stuff. Got back, prepared everything, and was watching TV with both my parents while waiting for dinner time to roll around. Dad asked me how everything was going, listened to the reply, and then said, I think I'll shut up now. A minute later, I realized he was breathing funny. He died in my arms as Mom called 911. The worst part was doing a heart massage for 5 minutes while we waited for the ambulance. He was clearly gone, and he would have been so upset if I'd brought him back. But you can't not. Story 10. Scientists think that only something like 1/10 of 1% of all species that ever existed happen to be lucky enough to find themselves in the perfect conditions to fossilize for us to find. The vast majority of critters lived out their whole existence and either evolved to a new form or died out without leaving any trace for us to find whatsoever. Without a time machine, we could never know they existed, and if you could go back in time far enough, the majority of what we saw would be, to some extent, more or less a mystery. And we're not only talking about super ancient animals, squishy things that don't fossilize, or tiny microorganisms, but relatively recent megafauna, too. For instance, within our DNA, we have found evidence of a ghost population of a mystery species of our hominin cousins, with whom we, Homo sapiens, interbred. We have no other tangible fossil evidence for them. They weren't Neanderthals or Denisovans. We have no idea who these people were and wouldn't even have any idea they existed at all if we relied on the fossil record alone. They were an entire species of people that we lived with and knew intimately, just up and gone without a physical trace. What other creatures might have been that we cannot begin to imagine? Story 11. 90% of nursing homes are absolutely horrific. I'm an EMT and have been in and out of many of these facilities. Some are high quality, clean places with staff that really care. The vast majority reek of human feces, have employees who don't care about the residents at all, and serve them barely edible mush for food. The worst one I ever saw neglected to put a patient on their prescribed oxygen, nearly killed them. Actually, might have. Never found out that turned out. But when I left them at the hospital, they were circling the drain. Story 12. The Olympics is the excuse for massive amounts of government corruption. Ever notice how every Olympic stadium is built new rather than using existing structures? Ever notice how they always go over budget, often by double or sometimes even triple? Ever notice how they all seem to be famously low quality despite this? And yet, every year, who gets to build this crappy facility at enormous taxpayer expenses, hotly contested? It's because an Olympic facility is the perfect opportunity for civil servants to do or repay favors for local businesses and their cronies. You want to get in good with the deputy mayor? His brother owns a paving company, and you're in charge of getting the Olympic Village paved. Why not give him a ring? We're going to need a lot of rebar. Why not ask the owner of that steel foundry you're trying to buy a Corvette from what he'd charge? And pointedly decline to see if that offer is market competitive. Story 13. That the chances of survival, if you go into cardiac arrest outside of hospital, is incredibly low. I think it's something like 20%, but maybe even lower. Even if someone is doing trained CPR, TV and movies have made us have this idea that you can just do a few chest compressions and the person wakes up. That very rarely happens. Usually, you're just doing it long enough until a medical professional can come and take over, and then they still might not be able to do anything if they can't get a shockable rhythm going. Story 14. The American home has more clutter than anywhere on Earth. U.S. children, representing just 3% of the global population, account for 40% of the world's toy purchases. Some estimate the number of items in the average home to range between 60,000 and 300,000 distinct items. Home clutter and possession of excessive items contributes negatively to mental health. I spend most of my time at home and started looking into all this out of curiosity. Wound up severely emptying my home and only keeping items I actively use. It was a lot of crap to give away or toss, but it did indeed make a great impact, mentally and practically. The ease of cleaning and organizing and the emptiness itself are pleasing. Plus, my remaining possessions have real value and stand out. Story 15. There's no diagnostic test for ALS. One day you either lose your ability to speak or a hand stops working. You have to go through a battery of tests to rule out all other things that could be wrong with you. When those tests are negative, then you have ALS. Then your body slowly stops working over the course of the year. Your mind is still sharp as it ever was, but you cannot speak, eat, or swallow your own spit. You require constant supervision. Only when all your dignity is taken does ALS finally kill you. And we have absolutely no idea how to cure ALS. Sometimes it's genetic, but most of the time it hits randomly. Story 16. In 2005, while searching for a stolen laptop in the Phoenix airport, the baby of a newborn girl was found in a garbage can. The baby, named Baby Skylar, was found by complete accident. And if not for the stolen laptop, Skylar would have ended up in a landfill, with the only person knowing of her existence being the woman who birthed and soon after killed her. The sad fact that no one will know how many Skylars were never and will never be found. In lighter news, about a week ago, police released the news that using genetic genealogy, Skylar's mother was identified and will be extradited back to Arizona to face murder charges in Skylar's death. Story 17. The second most common type of breast cancer does not show up on mammograms. 30 to 40% of breast cancer is lobular, and yet mammograms are not effective at screening for it. Found out last year my wife has it, and we were both shocked to find that out. No women I tell this seem to be aware either. It's much more common in women with dense breast tissue or disguises as that, and can be found with a simple ultrasound. But for some reason, doctors don't routinely order ultrasounds for women with dense breast tissue during breast exams. I thought maybe it was an insurance issue, but since telling people this, I have had a couple of friends demand ultrasounds, and insurance is covered it each time. Story 18. That when you are declared brain dead, you are pronounced legally dead, and a death certificate is signed and dated by your physician. Even though your heart is still beating, you have a blood pressure and oxygen saturation levels regulated by a ventilator, you just have zero blood flow to your brain. And your brainstem is operating at its most basic function only, supported by medication. I wholeheartedly believe in science and I understand that brain death equals death. It's a hard concept for my family to grasp, though. Extreme sadness. Story 19. During the Chechen War, there's an audio tape of two commanders, one Russian and one Chechen who both knew each other. The Chechen commander urges the Russian commander to pull his unit of 1,000 men. They were all slaughtered from invading and talks about how they both won't survive fighting. It went like this, Chechen. Please, Askil, you know that if I see you in action, I won't show you mercy. The same you will do to me. Russian. I have my orders. I'm a soldier. Chechen. We both know that we won't survive the fighting. All for what? I urge you to retreat your men. Have pity on their mothers. Your men will not survive. Russian. I can't. I just can't. Chechen. From the bottom of my heart, I hope you survive this, but you must leave for you and your men's sake. The Russian commander is killed during the fighting as well as his men. The Chechen's fate is unknown, but he most likely died as well. Story 20. The long-term effects of concussion are quite regularly not spotted, as there are a large number of people who have had concussions but not had it diagnosed and only felt the effects years down the line. I was diagnosed with a concussion when I was 20 and only started to feel the long-term effects in the last 3 or 4 years. In particular, fatigue, sleep disturbances, headache, blurred vision, and short-term memory loss. I put it down to everything around COVID. At first, because I first got my symptoms around the time everything was locked down. And with the blurred vision, thought, well, I'm nearly 40, so maybe it's just deteriorating with age. And only in the last few months had a doctor say that with my medical history of a concussion, plus when questioning about sports, lifestyle, etc., I said I played a lot of football, soccer, in which you had the ball a lot, and I've trained boxing for years. Then there's a chance I have post-concussion syndrome, but they need to run more tests. Obviously, I've stopped boxing, stopped playing football, and I'm very wary, if not a little frightened and disturbed, that something that happened 17 years ago can be having an effect now due to the compounding effects of somewhat smaller, repeated blows to the head from heading a football and sparring sessions with boxing. We always use headgear, 16 ounces gloves, and never spar hard. But still, if you get caught, it's a blow to the head. I always thought that was something people with repeated huge blows to the head got. Not normal people, but I'll find out soon enough if it is that or something else. Story 21. There are still insanely high rates of FGM around the world, even in relatively modern countries like Egypt, where 91% of women and girls have undergone FGM. That's almost their entire female population, tens of millions of women and children. 76% of those procedures in Egypt were done by doctors. Doctors! People are using modern medicine to maintain this barbaric and ignorant practice. It's insane. The most common age this occurs is between 5 and 9 years old around the world. The West isn't exempt in this, as there have been thousands of girls this has happened across Europe and in the US. It's insanity to me that such a horrific act is widely accepted and perpetuated by so many people across the world. Story 22. Not sure the particular name, might have been hepatitis, but my grandma was teaching me about STDs to encourage me to stay safe, and she mentioned a specific one, which she said a friend of hers used to have back in the day. He's still alive, but on average, the guy took about 21 pills a day and wasn't allowed to be in crowded areas for risk of sickness or infection, which would kill him, pretty much barely living his life without much social interaction or fun. There was no known cure for him, and he lived in Cuba, so it was extremely hard for him to get treated if he even could. And I bet those pills cost him a lot, especially if he needed doses to last his entire life. Story 23. Quality of life has been, and will be, on a consistent downward trend. There is more suffering in the world today than any other period. We can get people to live longer, but only to get more out of them as slaves. The average slave died at 18 during Roman slavery period. My father's 65 and his retirement plan is death. If mortality and longevity were to be authentic indicators of quality of life, we would have to see a positive association, as in having a longer life for a positive reason, not negative. If increased technological advances in medicine and industrial and agricultural production was a positive thing, we would be working less, not times more than a Roman slave. Birth rates declining is an unintended feature of slavery, as slaves don't have the means to raise children. The more advanced a country becomes, the more its birth rates drop. It is easy to see why. Creation of wealth via the commodification of elements necessary for human survival: water, food, housing, etc. In Canada, our biggest GDP contributor is real estate, a parasitic industry in direct conflict with the inhabitants of the country, producing nothing but vulnerability, a great quality to manipulate a population. For example, the mortgage you buy, giving you the freedom of a home, has an amortization period longer than the average lifespan throughout history, despite the fact we have infinitely better technology to build a home compared to 2,000 years ago. If the human species were on an upward trajectory, we would see the average human living a longer, freer, and happier life, not an epidemic of mental health issues, homelessness, declining birth rates, and crime and violence. No chance for a home, no chance for a family equals no chance to fulfill our predetermined biological path as a species. In my opinion, these problems are a product of our future being robbed from us. If you take away the dartboard, don't be surprised when players miss the target. Story 24. The Judge Rotenberg Center in Massachusetts, USA, is the only center in the United States still electroshocking its patients. Its patients are primarily autistics. These patients are forced to wear a backpack device called a GED 24 hours a day that can be activated remotely to electroshock the wearer. The GED's standard shock has been reported to cause severe burns. Autistic patients are shocked routinely for things like being untidy, wrapping a foot around a chair leg, hand flapping, and failure to stop screaming while being shocked. At least 6 parties have died from its use, and one individual was consecutively shocked over 27 times. It has been ruled a torture device by the UN. Due to legal shenanigans, it is still in use to this day.